I'm really excited about our speaker today, Marie. This summer, me and my 5 girlfriends went over to Maui, and the devastation was just horrible. The stories we heard were sad, but they were also very heartwarming. I mean, people coming out to help people, and it was in a way a beautiful experience. It was very sad. We cried when we saw the devastation, but it made me realize how important this seminar is today. To be prepared, and we don't know what's coming. You know, in California, we have earthquakes, we have fires. Who knows, we might have floods. Who knows, one day we might have a tsunami. We don't know what the future has for us. And so I'm so thrilled that Marie has agreed to do the presentation. Come on up, Marie. Let's give her a hand, welcoming her to be our speaker today.
So my name is Marie Jones-Kirk. I'm the emergency manager here in the city of Encinitas. I work for the Encinitas Fire Department, and I'm so excited today to talk about one of my favorite topics. That's emergency preparedness. So before I jump into talking about this, how many of you have maybe started putting together, already have an emergency plan? Okay? How many of you have an emergency kit? Maybe you have something at home, in a car? Okay. Well, the nice thing about this presentation today is, as I like to say, and I was saying this to our commissioner, is it's good to know where we're starting, so then we know which direction we're going to go in. So why is this conversation so important? And to Christy's point, tragically, we've seen so many different disasters and emergencies that have impacted our community over the years. How many of you live here in Encinitas? Okay. How many of you live in Carlsbad? Okay. We have anybody in Del Mar? Solana Beach? The beautiful thing, or maybe some other city that I didn't mention. Okay. So the nice thing about what I'm going to talk about today isn't just about talking about preparing for a disaster in Encinitas, because disasters don't know borders. They don't stop. It doesn't get up to, oh, there's a fire that's in Rancho Santa Fe, it's going to stop at the border, not come in. A disaster emergency, you can experience it. You know, I've talked to people that were actually in Maui when the fires happened, right? But they had done some planning, so they carry those skills that they learn on emergency preparedness wherever they go. And an emergency, and I'll talk a little bit about what my role as the emergency manager. I plan for disasters to happen at 2 o'clock in the morning. When you're waking up and you're like, oh, what am I supposed to do? Oh gosh, where's my bag? That's part of what today is to hopefully take away some of that anxiety that comes with disasters and emergencies. So it's something, it becomes more automatic for you. You don't have to think about, where's my medication? What's my plan? Does my family know what's going to happen? You've already thought about it and you've practiced it. So let me tell you a little bit about my role and what I do as an emergency manager. So it's a new position here in the city of Encinitas. I actually have a team member, my boss, who did emergency management type responsibilities, but what you're finding, the more disasters that we're experiencing, not just in San Diego County, not just in the state of California, but throughout the country, more and more cities are investing in having an emergency manager. So my role is I plan for things that we hope that never happen. Part of my job is I write emergency plans, or I update emergency plans. I make sure that we have the resources or the supplies, so if we're going to stand up a shelter, as a matter of fact, this location here is designated if we had to stand up an emergency shelter, people had to evacuate. This is one of those places that is designated in our city. So we want to make sure that we have the supplies to be able to do that. We also, another part of my job is doing training. So we want to make sure that our city staff is ready. That 2 o'clock in the morning call comes and we have to stand up our emergency operations center. I do training for our staff, but also we take those plans, we take that training, and we do exercises and drills. So similar to what my team members in the fire department do on the fire operations side, they don't just, go to academy and then hope that they remember things. Every day they're doing some kind of training. So that's what my role as an emergency manager. So now I look to all of you and say, you are now appointed as emergency managers. Because you are emergency managers of your house, of your life, and the information that you get today is with the goal that you're going to take the information here, and I'm going to ask you to make a commitment to tell at least 2 people that you know about emergency management. Great if you tell 5 people, but I guarantee, and ask my husband if he was here, it's embarrassing. I can be standing in line at the market and I can talk to somebody about emergency management. So you never know where and when that conversation is going to come up, but it's an important one that you need to be having and thinking about every day. Because just like if you're going to plan, right, so if you've done estate planning, sometimes you have to go back and you have to review that plan. You have to make sure that information is up to date. Same things that will apply here. So let me talk a little bit about what we're going to be going through today on the agenda. And with the way that I look at emergency preparedness, this is more than just, and I'm not sure what expectations some people might have thought, we're just going to talk about an emergency plan and she's going to tell me what supplies I may need to buy. Emergency planning and emergency preparedness is really a layered approach. So that's kind of the approach I'm going to take today. We're going to talk about who's responsible for emergency preparedness. We'll talk about some of those hazards. Some of them Christy mentioned. We'll talk about mitigation steps, some of those things that we can do in advance of and additional to the preparedness. We'll go through talking about preparing, evacuation planning. Those become a very important part. If you have to shelter, you'll hear terminology like sheltering in place, or if you evacuate and you have to go somewhere to shelter, emergency notification. So how do you hear about if there is a disaster or emergency? Sorry.
No, I got it.
And then additional tools and resources. Okay, next. So let's talk about this a little bit on when we think about emergency preparedness. Oftentimes I will have people say that emergency preparedness is the responsibility of sheriff or police or the fire department. That's where my tax dollars go, and it's up to the city to take care of me and make sure that I'm safe. And I'm gonna say to you that emergency preparedness is the responsibility of the whole community. Because I can only write so many plans, we can do so much training, but the resiliency and the readiness of the community is up to everybody. So residents, community members like yourself, your neighbors, some of these you might have some connection to an HOA, maybe a faith-based organization, maybe you have some connections in this area. And I guarantee, because of the amount of disasters and emergencies that we've seen in the last 10 years, all of these organizations are talking about emergency preparedness. And we'll talk about it in a moment, about some of those hazards and why it's important to talk about them before the disaster emergency happens. All right. So one of the things when we look at hazards, one of the plans that I work on every 5 years, the City of Encinitas is required to update its hazard mitigation plan. So we look at probability of hazards that could happen in our city. We also look at the severity of what those hazards might look like. So this plan is in partnership with FEMA, so the Federal Emergency Management Agency, California Office of Emergency Services, and the County of San Diego. County of San Diego has kind of their major one that kind of goes over the entire county. So this particular document, if you want to go through and look at the hazard mitigation plan, you can go to the city's website. I can share that link with Christy so she can, if she sends a follow-up email, or you can also go to the County of San Diego and search for hazard mitigation plan. So if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you're having a hard time sleeping, great document. Light reading, good stuff. So, next slide, please. So let's talk about this. What kind of hazards do you think that impact our community? Fire, okay, what else? Flooding, okay. Earthquake. All right, any others that we think that might impact our community?
Train wreck.
Train wreck, okay, that's a good one. Yeah, that's the one that keeps me awake at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's a good one. We'll go to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, Susan.
Oh no, just if somebody hit a phone pole or something, or it would take out a phone or a power pole.
Okay, and that's a good one. We'll talk, that's actually good. So what this is, and this information actually comes from our hazard mitigation plan. So the things that we look at are, you can see on that left-hand side, are the ones that we call of significant or potential for extensive damage or impact to the city. It could be city's infrastructure, it could be our residents, our businesses, anything that would potentially impact what we call our continuity of operations, whether as a city or a community. So I'll be going through and talking about some of these. Then you see some of those things, kind of the limited impact potentially, and those additional hazards. So what you'll notice that we have on here is we have natural and man-made. And some of those hazards, like the wildland fire, can be natural, but we've seen wildland fires that have started because of a spark. Somebody's out there, it's hot out, low humidity, high winds, and they decided that's a perfect day to go out and do my weed whacking. That's awesome, right? So we've seen those fires. We've seen arson, tragically. So, but this kind of gives you an idea. When we look at this as a city, as a fire department, we're in all hazard response. We don't just respond, because a lot of times people think, oh, you just respond to fires. Well, no, actually, when you look at this, we're all hazard, and that's the same thing for my role as an emergency manager. But that's also the same thing for you, as my newly appointed emergency managers, is thinking about you're responding to not just and preparing for a multitude of different things that could happen. Now, does that mean that we are always in our mind thinking worst case scenario? No. But there's a great phrase that we use in emergency management. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So thinking about this and planning in advance hopefully isn't keeping you awake at 2 o'clock in the morning. So that's why when lady in the back mentioned the train right now, I feel like we have a plan, but it may not for me from an emergency management standpoint. I feel like we just need to do a little bit more work on that one. All right, Steve, on to our next one. So I'm going to take a moment, and I don't want to, the goal is, even though I appointed you as emergency managers, is not to bore you with all the gory details, but I want to share some information when we're talking about emergency preparedness. Because we need to think about what are we preparing for, and why do we need to prepare. So when you look at this, do you remember the time when we used to say, oh, it's fire season, right? There's no such thing as fire season anymore. It is a year-round. Tragically, here we are in November, and we have the mountain fire that's up in Ventura County, over 20,000 acres that's been burned, over 130 structures that have been not just, damaged, but destroyed. It's a huge impact, right? So we, as a community, have to understand that when we're preparing for emergencies, it's a year-round conversation. So how many of you have been here when we've experienced wildfires? Right? So, and usually when I ask that question, I know the answer that I'm gonna get, right? We've all kind of experienced that. One of the things that I want to kind of point you to is that wildfires, if some of you remember back, I live in Carlsbad. I worked for City of Carlsbad. I was their emergency manager for a while, but before I became the emergency manager, I volunteered for the city when the Point City fires happened in 2014. There was almost no time you were reacting. You weren't thinking about it, you were reacting. It happened so quickly. It was in May. There was winds, there was the low humidity, it checked all those boxes. Stephen. So there are some tools that I use as an emergency manager, and you also will be able to have, we'll talk about this a little later on in my presentation, but I'm showing you this because this is just from last week. We had, when it was warm, we had the low humidity, we had winds. So this is information that I get from SDG&E on a daily basis, and that fire potential index. So they're looking at how much moisture do you have in the brush. They're looking at certain things. So sometimes we're like, my gosh, we got so much rain. That's great, we're not gonna have any fires. Well, because what does rain do, right? It produces growth, right? So you're gonna get some dry brush. So I show this to you because this is important information. And depending on where you live in the city, and we'll have it, my next slide, we'll talk about Steve, if you want to go to the next slide. So what this is, it talks about where the very high fire severity zones are. So take a moment, look at that map. How many of you live in a high severity area? Maybe out in the Levine, Saxony Canyon area. So here's one of those things is that you don't have to wait for the city, or in the case, and we'll talk more about this in evacuating, you don't have to wait until you get a reverse 911 call. You don't have to wait for somebody to tell you to go. If you know weather-wise, it is hot, you have low humidity, it's windy, you can always look at it and say, you know what? I live in this area, I'm gonna make sure my car is packed up and I'm ready to go. So, and that's, being emergency managers, that's some of the information that you have. You get to make those decisions in advance. All right, Steve, next slide. So earthquakes. A lot of times when we think about earthquakes, and how many of you are California natives? How many of you have experienced and gone through that earthquake, right? And this is one I would say that we've kind of been lulled into that false sense of security of thinking earthquakes don't really happen, right? We haven't had one of significance. How many of you have been watching and seeing what's been happening on the news as related to the earthquakes that are happening up in LA County, up in kind of in that area? So that's another thing that keeps me awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, because oftentimes we think of the San Andreas Fault, but probably the larger and more impactful fault that we have here, and that runs kind of along our coast here in Encinitas, is that Newport Inglewood Rose Canyon Fault. As a matter of fact, it's so important that the County of San Diego Office of Emergency Services, the beginning of next month, is bringing together public safety partners, cities, utilities, other partners to actually do what we call a tabletop exercise just on the potential, if there was a large-scale earthquake, how we would respond as response agencies. So it's important to kind of look at and understand what that impact is. Because, again, when you think about that, and you think about an earthquake, we have kind of what we talk about in fire services. You can have an earthquake that could cause a fire. You could have an earthquake, and to Susan's point, you could have an earthquake and you could have down power lines, and now we have a power outage. So sometimes what you're planning for isn't just maybe one disaster or one emergency. Okay? See, next slide, please. All right, this gives you an idea. So, and again, this isn't to scare you. This isn't to say, time to move out of Encinitas right away. It's to look at this and go, okay, we have this fault. We need to be thinking about what steps, what kind of things are we going to be talking about? Because one of the things I'll talk about in a moment is about mitigation, right? So this preparedness, we're taking this layered approach on how we're going to be approaching emergency preparedness. Again, for me, how many of you believe that information is power?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so that's why this information today is to empower you with this information to hopefully make you and encourage you, nudge you a little bit, to focus on emergency preparedness. Next slide. All right, severe winter weather. Right? How many of you feel like, gosh, we've like 2 winters back to back. We had a fair amount of rain. Remember earlier this year, January 22nd, we saw the devastation, especially down in southeast San Diego County, the amount of flooding that we had. They call that a 100-year flood. So part of what I do in that hazard mitigation plan is we do tracking. We look at, I'm not the smartest person in the room when it comes to science and predictabilities, but there's a lot of people that look at weather and make those predictions. We work a lot with the National Weather Service office here in San Diego County. And we're talking about flood zones. Where do we think that it's gonna flood? So some of you, if you've lived in Encinitas, and I'm not new to North County, but I'm getting to know some of our flood zones. I was gonna say, Wish that we hadn't gone through the January 22nd storm, but I definitely learned a lot about where are our flood zones, where are those areas that are gonna be, we're gonna see that are gonna be more impactful. That's also important for all of you. So if you live in an area that you know is prone to flooding, and you have to think about you're gonna evacuate, just be mindful of that. Because how many, like with the January 22nd storm, we saw certain areas of the city where that water rise happened fairly quickly. So you want to make sure that you're really mindful to that. The severe winds, this kind of goes into what Susan mentioned a moment ago. We've seen throughout the county, and one of the things that, and I know, when I bring up SDG&E, we might let out a groan because, we've all felt kind of the impact of seeing rising costs. I try to separate those two out as a ratepayer from the standpoint of from the emergency management side. Because SDG&E from an emergency management side, if you went through the '03 fires, remember they had a lot of things where they did not, what they call, they didn't turn off the power in advance of. There's a lot of things that they're looking at, and they've learned a lot to understand why you want to de-energize in certain areas, because you don't want those trees falling onto the lines. Again, secondary incident, you can have fires that happen. So, but the impact that winter storms happen. How many of you remember when we had up on Lake Drive, we had the sinkhole back in 2023, okay? So that's probably one of the biggest things that we can look at. Okay, I want to hear that story afterwards because there was some giggles over there. So if you remember that Lake Drive sinkhole, right? It seemed like, and we always say, oh gosh, that happens in another city until it happens in yours, and you're like, that was, but I learning about that and understanding it, right? We're talking about that damage to infrastructure, right? It took some time to be able to, engineers came in, you had our engineering team, the different steps that they had to take. And if you lived in that area, from what I've heard from staff, and I've talked to a couple of community members, the impact that caused to traffic, right? So these are things, again, as emergency managers, when you're putting together your plan, you're thinking about these different things. All right, see, next slide, please. All right, so potential flood hazards. Of course, if you live in a coastal city, which everybody here does, we already know some of the things that we're seeing. And those are some of the things that we look at. If you look at we have two documents. So I mentioned the hazard mitigation plan, but we also have our climate action plan. Every city has to put one together. That's also up on the city's website. You're going to hear that terminology about sea level rise. So there are certain things that we know, right? So we know down in Cardiff, you see some flooding. You know that entrance into the campground area, you're going to see some flooding in that area. For those of us who live in Carlsbad, we know Ponto, right? We know that area is going to flood. So there's certain areas that, again, I'm mindful about and thinking about, where is it going to flood? I'm looking at this. It's knowledge I'm taking in. I'm mindful about those things. Next slide, please. Mitigation. So in emergency management, there's kind of, 5 areas that we focus in on. And so there's certain things that you are doing before that disaster or emergency happens. So mitigation might seem kind of like an interesting thing. Wait, shouldn't you just be talking about me putting together a plan? Should we just be talking about what we're going to put into a bag if I have an emergency? But you also want to think about what are things that you can do to your home, whether you own the home, you rent the home. Some of you may live in an independent or assisted living. There are certain things that you can think about related to your home to mitigate the impact a disaster emergency is going to happen. I wish I could stand up here and tell you we will never have a disaster emergency in our community. But that's not going to happen. But what I want you to do is think about when you leave here, whenever time you get home, is start thinking about those things. So mitigation, and this is the only time I'm going to read through this, is the reduction of loss of life and property by lessening the impact of disasters and includes any activity that prevents an emergency or reduces the effects of a hazard. So next slide, please. So some of the things that you need to think about. Propane tanks. I remember early on in my emergency management career, I thought, my gosh, my husband and I have a propane tank at, For our barbecue, we have an extra propane tank. Wasn't thinking about that. Well, you know what? That comes almost like a rocket. If that thing, we have an earthquake, that falls over the potential. If you live in an area, I'm going to use like a leave-behind, you might not be, you might still have propane, right? So depending on where you live, there was a time in my career where I worked out in Elfin Forest and we were on a propane tank. So that was definitely something where I worked with the fire department in San Marcos to talk about strapping down that propane tank. So it doesn't have to be your little propane tanks that you use for barbecues. It can be something, a larger propane. Chimneys, another thing, if there is an earthquake, right? So there's all sorts of good information out there on how you can, reinforce your chimney. And a lot of times this information, if you reach out to your insurance company, so if that's homeowners or renters insurance, they can have this conversation with you. Because for them, right, there's a benefit, because as you know, insurance has gone up because of the amount that they've had to pay out. So if you can help mitigate that impact, it can be very helpful. So, and eliminating potential trip hazards or blockages to exit. So we're going to talk about when you are exiting. We're going to talk about an evacuation plan in your home and what that looks like. So when you think about this is, again, as emergency managers, you may think, oh, we have an emergency, I call 911 and the fire department will come out and help me. But if our emergency services become overwhelmed and we as a city cannot respond, there's a fire, we're going to call in what we call mutual aid. We're going to call in other agencies. We're going to prioritize. Now, I will say we will prioritize the vulnerable in our community, but we also have to make sure that if we have a fire, that we're going to be sending resources there. So the goal is, where we can, and you're let me talk about this a few times, is relying on people in your family. Your family doesn't have to be biological, right? Oftentimes I say your tribe, right? That doesn't have to. For some people, my family is biological. I have kind of a very extended family, so kind of keeping that in mind. Next slide, please. So the non-structural hazard mitigation, heavy furniture. You have a headboard, looking at and securing that headboard, because you don't want, if you have an earthquake, you don't want that headboard to fall over. You might be thinking about, if you have a wall unit, if you have heavier furniture, just securing those things. You can go to Home Depot, they have furniture straps, they have different things that you can look at. And I don't know, and I'm going to look at my commissioner, do the city of Encinitas or Encinitas community have any, maybe through any of our faith-based organizations where they will go in and help seniors with certain, so I say, light duty kind of help, kind of honey-do list?
If you do, yes.
Okay, they do, okay. So I think that might be good information we can share after. And I'm respectful. Some of the things that we're talking about here, some of the things are free, some of the things might cost some money, so I'm mindful to that. You notice I left the child-proof cabinets. How many of you have grandchildren? So if you have grandchildren, emergency management and emergency preparedness isn't just for you. If you have grandchildren to come over, you're going to want to think about if they're at your house or if you're over at, family's house and there's kids, making sure that things are kind of, that child-proof piece. That's also kind of falls into that. How many people know where their gas, water, electricity, where those things are? So if you don't, remember what I said at the beginning. We know where we're starting, so then you know what you have to kind of, where those things are at. And if you are in a place that, let's say it is a condo or a townhome, and you're like, well, that's the property management's responsibility, I'm going to encourage you, find out where those are at. And make sure, because sometimes they may not know. They may say, well, that's our maintenance person, they're responsible for that. But I would still ask that question. And then securing the water heaters, again, that's kind of another, important thing. And I'm not, nor will I ever represent my fire prevention team members, but I believe if they were here, they would tell you that, having that strapping, I believe, is actually now required. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let's talk about, now we're going to prepare for a disaster. We know what the hazards are, we know where we can find some information. So we've talked about the hazards. Now we're going to dive in a little bit deep. We're going to talk about kind of the warning systems. Consider important elements of disaster preparedness. Disaster preparedness, in addition to having that plan, throwing things into a bag. You've got your go bag, as we call it, or your go kit. But you might have some other things that you're going to want to consider if you have to evacuate or we have a disaster or emergency. Specific needs for yourself, and maybe you live independently, maybe you live by yourself, or maybe you have other people that you live with that, may be part of your family, roommate, whatever that situation is. It's important that you know what each person's needs are, because that helps when you're doing the planning. Okay. Important one. I added this one because how many of you, and I forever was, and I'm honest in telling you this, I wasn't very good at times. I would, run my tank till it was almost empty. I work and live close, I live close to here. But now it's like really important to make sure that you have at least a third of a tank of gas. And if you have a electric or hybrid vehicle, just make sure that it's charged. So that's an important piece, because if you have to evacuate, you have to get out, you don't want to think about, gosh, do I have enough gas in the tank to be able to do this? Okay, next slide, please. I'll go into some of the more details on this. Okay, making a plan. So one of the things you're going to get some handouts when you leave today. And one of my favorite tools that we have here in San Diego County is this guide right here. So, though you're not going to get a copy of my presentation, better yet, you're actually going to get this workbook that gives you some of the tools. It's going to, in addition to, and when I say that, I don't mean that rudely, that you're not going to get the presentation, but really a lot of what you find and what I'm going to be talking about is in this guide. So making a plan. But an important piece is that you're going to want to designate, hopefully, somebody outside of the area that knows what your plan is, right? And you're thinking about, who's your emergency contact going to be? You may already have that, right? So if you already think about this in relationship maybe to your medical care, you might already have somebody that's your emergency contact. You may have, family, friends, somebody maybe outside the area. But I'm looking around and I'm seeing maybe we've got about 45 people here. If you're new to the community, maybe you don't have that connection yet, look around. You've got a tribe of people here now that are fellow emergency managers, and maybe you make a new friend, all of a sudden you're like, wait, you're my neighbor, I have that connectivity, we can talk about developing our plans together. I know what your plan says, I know what mine says, and in a disaster emergency, you're working together. So, involving your family and friends in that conversation. So if you're going to, and I'll use the example, if my husband and I are we have to evacuate out of Carlsbad, we have to leave the county, we've already had a conversation with my son up in Orange County to know, hey, we're coming to your house. As long as you're in a safe location, know that we'll probably be evacuating to your house. We've already identified also a few hotels that we might go to. We haven't made the reservation yet, but we've kind of identified in advance. And we've shared that with family so they know that in advance. Review and update your emergency plan. And the important stuff list periodically. We'll talk about that in a moment. Just like I said, when you're thinking about this plan is not something you're going to be like, okay, I worked on it today. I drop it into the drawer, or how many of you have a junk drawer at home, right? Where just things go and they just kind of magically disappear. That's not your emergency plan. I'm going to ask and suggest on your emergency plan, and we'll talk about your emergency kit in a moment, that every 6 months, you're just making sure things are up to date. And I'm going to use this example. How many of you have medication that you feel like, oh my gosh, it changes on a daily basis? Guess what? Your medication is going to be part of that emergency plan. So you're going to want to make sure, that's why you're going to want to update this information. Practicing your plan. So remember, as emergency managers, I talked about my role, what I do. You're gonna wanna make sure that when you put your plan together, that you can actually execute it, right? So you're gonna wanna think about these things, your plan. We'll talk a little bit more in detail this. And then one of the things that you're gonna get, and this is actually probably one of my favorite things that we'll provide today. County of San Diego, Aging and Independent Services, they provide this form. It's called the Vial of Life. And this provides where you can capture this information. How many of you have one already or have completed one?
We have one.
You have one? So what's great about this form, you are kind of putting down some of the basic information about yourself. You're going to put in here things related to your emergency contact, medical information. There's two sides to this form. A lot of times I encourage people, and just so you know, prior to coming into emergency management, I have volunteered and worked in the area of residential and senior care. So this is kind of my passion. One of the things in just making sure that we're communicating out. So if emergency responders, so think about this, it doesn't have to be a large scale event, but if an emergency responder comes to your door and they know nothing about you, if you've got this on a refrigerator or someplace that's easy for them to be able to see this, and they get some very basic, quick information about you, this becomes helpful. Because otherwise, they're coming in and they've never come to your house before, and they're responding for the first time to a 911 call. It's kind of sometimes helpful to know, depending on if you're nonverbal, you're not able to speak for whatever reason, they can get some very quick information about you. They know what medication you're on. They may know a little bit about your medical care. So this form you'll be receiving today. Next slide, please.
Thank you.
All right, some key elements of a disaster plan. Where will you meet your family or friends? Now, there may be some of you that, again, new to the community, maybe you live independently, maybe thinking about, well, I don't know if I have any family or friends and where I'm going to meet. How many of you come here to the senior center on a regular basis? Okay, so we've got some people. How many of you involved, maybe you have a faith-based organization, you go to church, you've got some connection through the community that way. Maybe you have some connection through Rotary Club, right? So there's so many different clubs and different organizations out there. There's a lot of ways that you can make those connections and have those connections. Who's your out-of-state contact? It doesn't necessarily have to be out-of-state. It can be out of area. So if the phone system goes down, right? How many of you remember back in, I think it was 2011, when we had the regional power outage? Okay, some of us, we were still working on the landlines, right? Some of us might have had, our landlines might have been tied to the phone company, or it could have been tied to, maybe it wasn't tied into the wall, right? It might have had the phone answering system. There was a lot of people that couldn't make outside calls. Not everybody had cell phones, that's hard to imagine now, but there was people that didn't have that. So thinking about that, will you have an extended stay, shelter in place? So sheltering in place, and I have a slide that we'll talk about that, but when there's a disaster that happens, there's a fire that happens, and usually this is how it responds. You'll get fire department that will show up on scene, respecting some of that you live in Carlsbad. For those of us that are in Encinitas Del Mar, Solana Beach, we have our law enforcement is San Diego County Sheriff. Carlsbad has its own police department. Police department will show up. They're working together, the fire department and police department. But ultimately, if there's a determination to make an evacuation, and that's going to happen, you may hear, we're going to have you shelter in place, right? Because we don't want people clogging up the roads if we don't have to evacuate, right? Because we're trying to get emergency personnel in. So they may say, hey, right now we just need you to shelter in place, but be ready to go, okay? So, how will you evacuate your home, workplace, school of worship? This is not a complete list, but just to give you an idea. Because remember, a disaster emergency can happen anywhere. So when you're thinking about this, if I'm here at the senior center and you have to evacuate, you're thinking about those things. What are some of those things that you're gonna do? What route? Okay, the example I use, I live on a cul-de-sac. Basically, I have one way in, one way out. Right? How many of you have kind of that on maybe a street or in your neighborhood? So thinking about that in advance. You don't have to wait until you get the call to evacuate. So if you live on a street where you know you've got one way in, one way out, you know, exactly, and that's kind of what I think. I'm kind of up at the back of the cul-de-sac, so I have to be really mindful and think about that, you know, when it comes to evacuating. And when I get down to the bottom of that hill, which way I'm gonna turn, and being very strategic about that. So you start to think about that. But as emergency managers, you're already doing that. You're like, oh my gosh, I have to evacuate. Even coming here, right? If we had to evacuate here, again, you're thinking about which way are you gonna go? You're thinking about your exit point. Trust me, my poor husband, we don't go anywhere where I'm not already thinking about where my evacuation points are. Also, do you have transportation? Some of you, you know, may not have a vehicle for whatever reason. You may not be driving for whatever reason. So thinking about that, do you have resources available? One of the things that gives me such great comfort being a resident of San Diego County, and I can talk about, you know, more recently when we had the floods in January earlier this year, is that there are a lot, it's not, remember I talked about whole community, right? That's emergency preparedness, but there's a whole community response that happens. It's not just the city of Encinitas, it's not just the county of San Diego. We have a lot of faith-based or not-for-profit organizations that will come in and assist. And there are definitely some resources that you may already be tapping into for transportation that will come forward and become part of what we call that emergency response. So I would suggest if you have Lyft or some of the other transportation resources that you ask them what their plans are if there's a disaster or emergency and find out what that is. And remember, I gave you the homework. You're going to talk to 2 other people. If you have any family or friends that have mobility challenges, better to think about your planning now than trying to do that when you have to at 2 o'clock in the morning. And that important piece, I'm going to keep tapping it on your head, is practice your plan. Next slide, please. All right, this is not an exhaustive list. And this information is going to be contained in that guide that I provided you. So take a moment, I'll highlight a few things, and then you'll notice I've got some props over here. So I'll let you guys go through and look at that list. A couple things I'm going to point out is you'll notice that 3-day water supply and food supply. When we think of in emergency management and we think in preparedness, it's with 72 hours in mind. So tragically, we had a real world example of where emergency personnel could not get in after disaster. Hurricane Helene, Asheville, North Carolina, they were cut off. Their roads, bridges, their infrastructure was destroyed. Emergency personnel could not get in. So having the food and water, and especially infrastructure, if something happens to our utilities, our water, you know, as advanced as our systems are, but we also have some aging infrastructure, making sure that you have those supplies on hand becomes really important. There's a few other things that are not on this list that I'm going to suggest. And a lot of times people will say, well, God, that's a lot. How do I pack that up? Because one of the things I'm going to say is you're going to want, if you have a car, have a bag, have something in your car. You may be thinking, God, that's a lot. Another thing, you can get a bag that has wheels, right? So you can wheel along. One of the things that I've done is my husband and I took an old suitcase that became one of our emergency preparedness bags. So the other thing is, if you look at this list, how many of you already have these items, some of these items in your house? So it's not sometimes that necessarily like the heavy lift, but the other thing that I suggest is you may not need, we're not at the beginning of the pandemic, so you don't need 50 hand sanitizers. But if you go in and you're like, okay, I'm going to go in collectively with a group of friends and buy hand sanitizer from Walmart or Target or off of Amazon, and you build your bags together. You throw your emergency preparedness party. Then you can kind of, again, buy in bulk and share some of those things. The other great thing is we've got some great thrift stores here in Encinitas. Some of the things, some of the bags, I've worked with people in the community, with seniors, and we put together bags by just going and buying, especially wait until after when school wraps up, you're gonna find backpacks. So it's a great time to go. You don't even have to wait, because I bet if we go now, we'll find some backpacks or something that you can use to put supplies together. It's on there, but having a hand crank radio, not expensive. You can, to have this, but it's really important. Hard to imagine, you're like, wait, I may not have access to my computer. I may not have access to my cell phone. What am I gonna do? This becomes really important for you to be able to get updates, find out what's happening in that time of a disaster or emergency. This is probably one of my favorite tools, and I'm looking at Gina and Susan. We had the pleasure of being connected to the Carlsbad CERT program, and this was a standard tool. It's a 4-in-1 tool that you can use to shut off gas. You can, now granted, newer vehicles, this is probably not going to work on if you had to break the glass on windows or anything like that, just because of the heavier weight that they've done on vehicles, obviously for safety purposes. But this is I bought this off of Amazon, and afterwards you guys are more than welcome to come up and check out, the different things that I have up there. But this is one of my, just a great tool. But I'm gonna share this with you. And I deliberately, in some respects, don't clean this, because this is my toolkit. This toolkit has served many purposes in my life over the years. I think I used it one time for doing some arts and crafts. I've used it for various things over the years. But what's in here is tools. I've got hammer in here. I've got different things in here. You can tell it's lived a good life. But it's also been repurposed. This is in my vehicle. So I have one in my vehicle. My husband and I have a larger one at home. How many of you have extra screwdrivers at home? And you're like, what the heck? These work great. Put those in there. Because how many of you ever watched the show MacGyver? Right? As an emergency manager, you become MacGyver. You're like, I need to do something. You know what? I need to wedge something open. Oh look, I think I've got a screwdriver in here. I've got a tool that I can go to. So again, not an exhaustive list, but in the guide that I give you, you're gonna see some basic information in there. Next slide, please. Additional important items. So that is, remember a previous slide, it talked about important stuff. There are some things. Now, my goal is not to have you take over my job as the emergency manager. My goal is for you to be the emergency manager for your life, your family, your community. But there are going to be certain things that are going to be important to you. So some other added things that we have on here, we've got the birth certificates. That's important to have. So I look at this from a technology standpoint. Some of those important documents my husband and I have scanned, and we save them into the cloud, right? My understanding is, Chrissy said, we talked a little bit about technology, I think in one of the series, and I will say this to each and every one of you. I believe my contact information is on the information that Christy's provided you. So if any time you have questions like, wait, she said something about the cloud scanning, we can talk about that, and we can talk about how kind of best to store that. But here's the thing, I make no assumptions. In this presentation, there are things that each and every one of you can teach me about emergency management, so I make no assumption when it comes to technology. Also, things is your household inventory. How many of you have gone through and done a household inventory to know those things that if your house caught on fire today, that you would know, you'd be able to tell your insurance company, homeowners or renters, what kind of things you have in your home? That's okay, right? We know where we're starting. So these are things to think about, right? So, and having that in a place, again, 2 o'clock in the morning, you don't want to be Chicken Little running around your house going, oh my God, where did I put that? You want that one place. Prescription medications. That becomes really important that you have. Now, here's the thing that I tell people, is on your prescription medications, make a copy of every time you get a new script, and I know sometimes, and I get this, they're electronically transferred to your pharmacy oftentimes, but you can go on, depending on who your medical provider is, you can go onto a portal, or you can ask them, please provide me with the hard copies of my prescriptions, and make sure that you have them. Put them in a folder. You have them all in one place, because if you have to leave in the middle of the night, and you don't have your prescriptions with you, and you need to go and try to get these filled, and you're like, wait, okay, I take this, but gosh, I don't remember the dosage, I don't remember the quantity, right, the frequency, it's a nice to have. How many of you have an older pair of eyeglasses? I have eyeglasses, I have a couple sets, right? It's, what I do with mine is, I have mine that I know that I wear on the daily, but I will take my extra pair, my older ones, my prescription got updated, that'll get thrown into my emergency bag. So it's just that you have that. Hearing aids, jewelry. Now, granted, you may not be able to take all of your jewelry, but it's a thing to think about. If you have, a box that you can put, your jewelry in, or if you have special pieces, things that are important, right? Your costume jewelry you may not care about, but you know what? The heirlooms are some of those important pieces that you've gotten from somebody special, that you know where those things are at. Again, you'll see some of the other things that I have on here. I know that may seem kind of, silly, it's like to bring a favorite book or a game, but if you have to leave your home, and you may be gone for a little period of time, so whether you go to an emergency shelter, and we'll talk about that in a moment, or if you have to go to a family member's, sometimes it's nice, and also one of the things, I'm not going to go deep and wide in this conversation, but we've all kind of come through different experiences of emergencies or different things that have impacted our lives. There's a component around mental health that happens during a disaster and emergency. So sometimes, if it's a book that brings you comfort, and that can be whatever that may be, I suggest having that. Next slide, please. So the disaster supply kit, important piece. After the disaster strikes, you'll not have time to shop or search for items. We all remember, pandemic started, everybody's rushing to Costco to get the toilet paper. If we have a disaster emergency, and we saw this, and again, tragically, with Hurricane Helene, we saw people that were running to get generators. It was too late. They were gone. They were trying to get emergency supplies. And they hadn't done what all of you are doing. They hadn't prepared. They hadn't thought about this, right? So, as I said already, many of the items that we're talking about, you probably already have at home. Next slide, please. Evacuation planning. This becomes so important. Thinking about, and you can do this. You can grab a piece of paper, doesn't have to be fancy, no art class here. Think about the layout of your home. Think about where you have furniture. Think about your lighting. That's why in your kit you have a flashlight. I'm going to say in your bedroom, Make sure that you have closed-toe shoes by your bed. Make sure you have a flashlight by your bed. If you have to evacuate, you have to move out of that space at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're gonna wanna know, can I exit through a window? Where's my exit points through a door? And where am I gonna evacuate to if I have to leave my house? Okay, so remember, I'm talking about some of those larger hazards and disasters that can happen. But it could be there's a fire in your house. I'll use an example. A few years ago, my dog, I don't know, it was like maybe 1 o'clock in the morning. I worked for Carlsbad Fire Department. My dog's wrestling, something's going on. I wake up and I smell gas immediately. I run downstairs. I notice that our stove, it's an older gas stove, it was not completely shut off. So immediately, I'm calling the fire department. I have a little bit of a benefit because I work for the fire department. I'm an emergency manager. My husband and I grab our dogs. We run outside. We knew exactly where we were going to go. As I said, we live on a cul-de-sac. But we had to think about, we're going to have trucks, 2 trucks at least coming up that street. We need to think about where we're going to evacuate to. So, put together your evacuation planning. Next slide, please. Sheltering. Talk a little bit about this, that sheltering in place. Sheltering in place can, typically it can be for a few hours. That sheltering for the extended stay. Guarantee those that lived in Ashland, North Carolina, when they were watching Hurricane Helene, they were thinking this is happening in Florida, it's happening south of us. Never did they think that it was going to make it up to them. But we saw that, unfortunately, because of the damage to the infrastructure, there was an extended period of time where they were without care. And I know that this is hard for us to think about it because we look at the abundance of goodness that we have in our community and we think we have all these resources. But I wouldn't necessarily say, let's take that for granted. And that's why I get people who say, well, oh, she's a prepper, right? I say, yeah, I'm a prepper in emergency management clothes, but there's a reason why. Because when you see things, even though that might say, guarantee the people in North Carolina, they probably never thought that type of storm would ever make it to them. And if you listen to researchers and you listen to people, they were like, yeah, that probably wasn't going to happen. That mass care or community shelter, as I mentioned, this is a shelter location. How many of you have ever been evacuated before? So did you evacuate to a shelter, or did you evacuate to a friend's home, or where'd you go to?
My daughter's home.
Daughter's home. What about you?
Friend's home.
Friend's home, okay. And I'll
Love
see.
you forever.
Nice, I like that. So what happens is, I will say, in what we have found over the years is about 3% of the population that's going to be evacuated is going to go to an actual emergency shelter. But even though the majority of your needs are going to be met, we're going to have the bedding, we're going to have hygiene kits, because we respect. Most people leave when they evacuate, they have not done what all of you are going to do. They leave with the clothes on their back. So they don't have the hygiene kits, obviously. So we're providing hygiene kits, we're providing the showering, we're providing, the food, things like that. But I always also say it's a nice to have, right? That you have some basic things that will give you some comfort. Steve, next slide, please. All right, so how do we find out about an emergency notification? Here in San Diego County, the county recently updated its emergency notification system. How many of you are already signed up to receive, sometimes they're called reverse 911s, but we call them alerts. So if not, guarantee you will be. This is important because this is one of the ways that you will find out if there's a disaster or emergency that is impacting your area of the city, your community. It's really important. Now, there's 2 ways that those notifications come out. There's the one where I'm encouraging you to what we call opt-in. You're going to sign up, you're going to register your cell phone, you're going to register an email. Okay, so these kind of important pieces. If some of you may still have a landline, back when this system rolled out back 20 years ago, landlines were already brought into the system. So your landline will already be part of the system. The other notification option that we have is what we call a WIA. It's a wireless emergency alert system. That is driven off of cell towers. So if you drive into the area in the range of that cell tower, you are going to get that emergency notification. Okay? So, why is that important for us as a community? One is we have so many people that visit our community on a daily basis year-round. So that, for me, gives me some peace of mind of knowing that if I have somebody that is visiting from out of town and they happen to be in that cell tower area, they're going to get that emergency notification. So you'll see on this slide, you go to alertsandiego.org. I've made an arrow to where it talks about where you can register for emergency alerts. Next slide, please. I'm going to geek out for a second. This is one of my favorite tools that we have rolled out when the county updated its emergency notification system. Genesis Protect, 2 ways you can access this. You can download the app, and one of the things that after, you can do this now, you can kind of, look at downloading the app. We also have some QR codes, but also Bryce and I are here to help you, my team member in the back, to help you if you want to download that app today. But what I love about this application is you can identify up to 5 addresses. So you can, you know what? I have my home. Maybe my son and daughter live down in Spring Valley area. I'm going to put their address in there. Maybe I have other places that I want to identify. If there is a evacuation, so right now primarily we are using this for wildland fires. But the goal is as a region, because when we think of County of San Diego, all 18 jurisdictions use this. The unincorporated areas of San Diego County use this. So what happens? We're going to send out that notification through Alert San Diego. This automatically, real time, gets updated. Go to the next slide and we'll show it kind of in real time. Okay, I think I have somebody who mentioned that they live in Del Mar, in that Del Mar Heights area. This is actually world experience. This is what happened. It was the first time that we really used this in San Diego County. This rolled out in May. This is when we had what we call the Del Mar fire. So that red area is the Torrey Pines. That little area, that yellow area, is just to east of the Crest Canyon area in Del Mar. So the different, what we call zone status is, kind of the 3 that we use primarily here in San Diego County is an advisory. So think of it as ready, set, go. An advisory is get ready. Your warning is, okay, get set. Where there's a high probability that you're going to be evacuating. That order is, it's go time. You need to be not thinking about packing, not thinking about what you're going to take. Your vehicle is already packed, or you've already made arrangements on how you're going to evacuate. And I get this question sometimes. Can law enforcement force me to leave? No. They can't. Legally, they can't force you to leave your home. But keep in mind, if you stay, you become that secondary incident, and you pull from emergency response personnel to be able to respond to that disaster emergency. And I will tell you, there has been so many tragic examples that we have seen in just in the last couple of years of people who have chosen to stay behind because they're like, I don't want to leave my house, I don't want to leave my pets. And that's part of, and I apologize, that's one of the things I think I glossed over in our conversation about planning, and I appreciate that Gina and Susan shared this, right? Because our pets are family, right? How many of you have pets? I know for my husband and I, our pets are family, so can't imagine it. But you also want to make sure that your health is also important. So, I'm going to encourage you, just as I'm telling you to sign up for those alerts, is that you're downloading this application. So when I think about emergency preparedness, everything I'm sharing with you today becomes a tool in a toolbox for you. This is just a tool. How you use it, I don't want it to just sit in the box and go, okay, you know what? This becomes part of your plan. It becomes another bit of what we call situational awareness. Next slide, please. Okay, other tools. Other great tools that you can look at. San Diego Emergency app, and these are all applications that you can put onto your phone that you can have access to. The SD Emergency app, so anytime there's notifications that go out. How many of you have received a notification that there's a flash flood warning out of the East County? Right? So sometimes, right, you'll get these and you're like, but I don't live in the East County. A lot of times those are notifications that are being pushed out, and you'll see them being pushed out through kind of this SD Emergency